Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of AWS The Data Unraveled. My name is Jason Young. Some of you will already know me as the host of this channel. I sit at Amazon Web Services as part of the data and AI strategy team. And today we're joined by two very special guests here from Just Eat Takeaway. Would you like to introduce yourselves to the audience today?
Yeah, sure. So I'm James Osborne. So I look after a group at Just Eat where we focus on like the new things. We call it ventures. So everything that's outside of the core restaurant food delivery, from groceries to loyalty, and then into our AI and innovation space, which is probably a lot of what we'll talk about today.
Fantastic. And Liz?
I'm Liz. I manage data platforms and platform engineering for Just Eat, as well as thinking about technical strategy and architecture over the next couple of years. So going to have some fun conversations today about that.
Yeah, and I think elephant in the room is that when we talk about data and AI a lot at this channel, and one of the things is that everyone's really excited about AI, being able to really get the cool stuff out of data. And actually, you can see that a lot of people are playing around with AI tools, even if the data is not in the perfect state. But I think, for argument's sake, there's been a lot of this idea of this shift left, this idea where people need to start taking more control of the data before they plug it into AI. And I think we've seen that a lot in companies such as banking and financial services, where the data needs to be almost 100% correct. But I'm interested, through a lot of the discussions that, the both of you have had with me over the past, there's been definitely Just Eat Takeaway, a paradigm shift towards looking at data, in this same light. Even though you're not financial services, you have really good data, but you also have really bad data. So I'm interested to find out, in your teams as data engineers and how you use your data engineers to kind of take on more responsibility of data. How have you approached this question? Have you nailed the answer? Is this still a moving target for you? Maybe throw it over to you, James.
Yeah, so I think that, as you sort of say, playing around with data and AI where the data's not perfect, we've really seen that sort of come to life, right? Where we are bringing AI products into our day-to-day experiences, like the AI ordering assistant, and it hits limits quite quickly when the data's not there for us. And so you mentioned shift left, and that's something that Liz is really passionate about, and it's really important for me because my engineers are sort of hitting that edge. And we're doing some really great stuff, but then we're sort of saying to take it to the next level, we need to be the data needs to be there with us, and the data and products need to be together as one single thing rather than two separate streams, which is kind of where we've ended up and where we want to get away from.
As part of that journey, when I think about, I've been in the industry for 20 years, and data engineers, I don't even remember how that title came about, right? 10 years ago, it would probably be database administrators. They used to just take all the data and then put it into a purpose-built, database. It might be Teradata, or it might be on Hive. It might be on the old SaaS platforms. Anyone who ever did banking knows that SaaS is everywhere, right? So, and then suddenly this concept of data engineer came about. So I'm interested, from your perspective, Liz, how do you see the role of a data engineer having shifted so much the last 10 or 20 years? What's the future of data engineering from your perspective? And do you think that data engineers are able to adapt to that change?
I think it's quite a big question. One of the things that I have spent a lot of time thinking about, especially with the advent of AI, is actually what does it mean for data engineering? I think if we look back 10 years, when we really started to think about data, 10 years ago, we were just having applications that would just pump data into something like Teradata. And what we really cared about was financial reporting. And actually, engineers didn't really care about it, right? It was like a means to an end. Someone asked for it on some kind of spec, and we went, okay, fine. And we just dumped it over. Database engineers or DBAs really cared about the structure of that data. But actually, as software developers, we were on to the new cool stuff, and we were doing other bits and pieces. I think as we went to more of a data-driven world and we moved into the cloud, that's when we really started to see data engineering come into its own, because we started to talk about streaming. So it wasn't just about moving data into a database and doing something with ETL transformation. Then we started to talk about, okay, now we need to put it not only in this piece of cloud, but how do you make it accessible? And if you're going to stream it in, how are you going to do late state representation? How are you going to rebuild streams? And what are you doing with that data? So data engineering, I think, became really important, and it was necessary in those new cloud times. What I think, though, is interesting now in this new AI world is I almost see kind of like 3 buckets of challenges. The first thing for me is we've got engineers right now who are starting out playing with vibe coding. We don't really need data for that, right? Because they're just mucking around in the AI space of like, can we just write code? So they start writing some code, they're doing some vibe coding with AI, but they're just trying to figure it out. We then have people that then go, oh, actually, I want to train some kind of LLM, right? There's something that I want to do, right? I want to create some kind of agent, right? I've worked out vibe coding. I know where I'm kind of going with that. I've moved on, right? I want to do something cool. And then they suddenly go, oh, but hang on a minute, where is that data, right? Like, I know what I need to get my hands on. How am I going to do that? How do I train data? Like, how do I get my hands on it? What do I need? Do I want a key value store? Hang on a minute, what's going on? And now this engineer who hasn't really spent any time with data engineering is now suddenly trying to figure out this other world. And then I think we then have data engineers who are then trying to go the other way, who are now going, well, hang on a minute, I've now got engineers trying to build out key value stores and are doing something that I haven't seen done before. But equally, I want to be doing more data pipelining, there's some bits and pieces. So now we're starting to see the world merge a bit together. So for me, I think with data engineers, we're going to start to see more of a merge between what we'd call traditional application engineering and data engineering becoming more just as one. And I suspect that as we go through this AI revolution, we're going to be bringing more data engineering principles to everybody. And it won't become such as a distinct role, as in part of the job for all engineers.
Yeah. Actually, we always talk about like data value and the data value chain from the point in which data is ingested and put into a streaming or a message bus, and then as you're consuming. And actually, you've got people who will build out your insights dashboards, that's all the way on the right. And then you'll have people who do the initial ingestion, and it might be a data engineer. But actually, a data engineer, almost you could argue as the role, they span all across. So I'm interested to get kind of, your thoughts, James, around if you were to hire a data engineer today, would you expect that data engineer to know all the skills required to take data from ingestion all the way to actually building an application? Actually, do you think because of what you've mentioned, Liz, where everything is kind of being compacted, maybe there needs to be more roles-based data engineers, and then you would have one data engineer do some work and then hand it over to another data engineer to then carry on that value? Or do you think it's better to have almost like a thin slice of a data engineer that can do one thing really well for like a very small part from end to end? Like, what's your thoughts around like compartmentalizing and handoff versus just data engineers that work in independent streams?
I think that the handoffs can become really painful, right? But you have sometimes you need the depth. So something that I think we're looking at a bit more is like how many of that sort of like depth, how many people do we need to build the structure? And then the majority as it sort of becomes that stream across, and being able to like make the best use of that data for their like product context or the AI tool we're trying to launch or whatever it might look like. So we need both in a larger organization for sure. We have fewer sort of structural engineers, so like building out with the architecture and the governance, and probably working in a platform type world with Liz. We have actually quite a lot of like data generalists who are saying, well, okay, how do I get this specific data around? So I think you have both sort of pairs, but you need maybe a few specialist structures. Like I really know how to make ingestion easy to scale and to like hook into. And at the other end, maybe I need to be able to really like make dashboards really easy to build. So you have a few people like leading on those, and then a lot more who are sort of like folding into the day-to-day application teams and like building these capabilities with data and sort of taking that ownership of their data almost through the entire stack. So always the way that we say in software, like a little bit of both, a little bit it depends. But I think you sort of look at those two sorts of sides, specialists setting us up for success, and then the full sort of shot through unlocking the value of a particular product line or something like that.
Yeah, and actually what you've just mentioned is the crux of the issue sometimes that we talk about in this channel around, doing anything fundamentally requires a business value attached, right? And the business value is attributed when you're solving for a use case. If you think about like someone who is business savvy, who sits in marketing and they understand what is it that they want to solve for as a pain point, do you feel right now the data engineer skill set or the mindset of the people that are hired as a data engineer, do you feel that they have the right capabilities and skills to really understand those use cases, or do you think there's a bit of a knowledge share or a journey that we need to take data engineers to understand what is the value that they bring to the business? Like how far have we been able to kind of reduce that gap in terms of what is it that they're delivering as business value versus is there a longer journey that we need to take?
So I think there's a consistent reconnection to the value that we're delivering, and as we become more specialized we can sort of step away from it sometimes, and I think that maybe data engineering is an area where we've seen sort of the stepping away be quite big, because what a lot of data engineering has been solving problems of how do I take this data in this format and get it over here in that format, but why? And it's it's a hard technical problem, so I'm focusing on that rather than the business value unlock that comes with it. So I think there's definitely a lot of journey that we want to go on. We're certainly doing a lot of that kind of work because we sort of say, well, we need to bring data closer to our product engineering teams. We need to bring data engineers closer to it. So we need to educate about the value that we bring to life as well. We're doing that at Jet now with a few different routes. So whether we're using our AI ambassador program when it's got that little AI hat or focus on it, or whether it's like Liz's Jetflix program where we use that sort of social media type channels to educate people and connect them back in. I think it's really important, and it is probably somewhere where there's quite a big gap in quite a few areas.
I mean, just
to add on to that, right? I think a lot of chief data officers, I think, around the world are trying their hardest to bring the most amount of value to their data, right? And that equation is, how do you do that, right? And how do you figure out what that looks like, right? So we're paying thousands, millions in store and compute, and kind of everyone's being asked, how quickly can you get that insight? How valuable is that insight? And I think there's lots of different types of insight. Right, there's observability insight. A lot of the time we joke about all the amount of insane ML that we can do and the insane AI that we can do. But actually, a lot of the insight that we have is how quickly can we crunch a number on a spreadsheet, right? Because that's what everyone likes the most. Or sometimes the value of our data is a PowerPoint presentation, right? I mean, that's where that lands. Where I think, though, the world is changing and where I think we're starting to look, especially at Jet, is that with data engineers, are we aware of what we can do in today's world, right? We talked a lot about ML, but now with the advent of AI, are we really understanding how we can unlock that value so that applications are smarter with every use? And I think it's that piece that we're really looking at and starting to play upon. And I think before, data engineering has sometimes been somewhat nebulous, right? So as you've kind of pointed out, right, they're getting data from here to there, and maybe that value is landing on a spreadsheet, right? They haven't really understood. Sometimes they have, because it's been clear, hey, I want this application to consume customer data, personalization data. Can I do something really interesting with pricing because we know who you are and you're a valued customer of ours? But now it's actually, how are we using this data to train models, right? How are we getting much, much smarter? And I think that's becoming a new and more nuanced approach that we're having to take and re-educate our data engineers on. And not only our data engineers, but also our application engineers. And it's these two coming together that I think we're starting to see that mesh.
Yeah, and actually, this is quite interesting because, the skills, when you think about an application engineer and a data engineer traditionally, is a little bit different, right? I mean, the use cases or what they're instructed to do for a data engineer is about getting data in a ready state, and it has been kite marked, it's been quality controlled, and it's there for people to use. And theoretically, an application engineer is taking that data and then creating the applications. They're using different coding techniques such as Scala, Perl, C#. When you combine the two spheres together, has there been a bit of a friction point in terms of application engineers saying, well, I do this one thing, which is I build applications, and the data engineers saying, well, I traditionally do this. And when you try and mash them together, there's two spheres that clash to each other. Have you seen that cultural kind of clash already at Jet?
a very recent example of this that I think is quite funny, when I almost think about it as two sides of the same coin. And application engineers and data engineers, I sometimes feel doing the same things, but talking the different languages. And you sometimes laugh, right? So we were talking about a semantic layer on the data side, and on the application engineering side, we're talking about a schema. And so for us, what we're really trying to do at the moment is, from a governance perspective and as part of our shift left, is really understand when we talk about our domains, we want to have governance around our domain. Now, in the application world, we have some level of governance, we have object structures, and we have this idea of a domain. On the data side, we have a semantic definition of a domain, right? So what do we mean by customer? On both sides of the coin, we're using different languages. Actually, they're still defined by JSON on either side of that. And what was quite interesting is we put the two people in a room together and went, how different is your JSON schema from your JSON schema? And these are just schemas, whether you want to call it a semantic definition of it, or whether you want to call it a schema or a grammar of a language of this. How are we describing what this customer is? What's that definition of it? And actually, I want to bring that definition as close to the point of data creation as we can. So application engineers have to be on the same page. What we found in having these conversations is that actually they just happened not to be too far off. And we really discovered in that conversation that we really were talking about the same things in different ways. And so that's a kind of a highlight in my mind, as to we really are starting to see a bit of a merge and an overlap.
Yeah, and actually, 5-6 years ago, the construct of what we call data products and data contracts was really big, because people wanted to build out data fabrics and data meshes where people on the application side, they can take whatever data they wanted, they can query data at its state, and then they can then bring their own compute. But in order for that to work, they needed to have the trust in the data. So you need to build out these contracts. But like you said, the problem is that sometimes those contracts, they were wildly different and people were abusing the contracts. So then they would shut down the data. And actually that created an adoption issue, because no longer were the data consumers using that platform. They felt as though the contract was too prescriptive, and they wanted to go off and do other things. And we've seen there's been a massive drop-off in terms of the adoption of data platforms. You saw a lot of organizations spend a lot of money in data platforms, but they never got the use out of it, so they went back to siloed platforms. So what you've just said, Liz, is that in order to really incentivize application engineers and data engineers to speak the language, you almost need to force them together to talk to each other and find out that there's not much of a difference. And once you can find out the difference, you can then build a contract off the back of that. So I'm interested to find out, how much of Jet's journey is it about enforcing a contract or a framework, versus is it more of a cultural shift of just having two areas or different areas talk to each other? And once you know that there's a common language, you can then enforce the framework. How much is it framework first and then doing things second, versus let's just get people to just talk to each other?
For me, it's both. What I think is, where I think we're trying to get to at Jet is, how do we almost kind of create like an Amazon marketplace, right? And I joke about it being like an Amazon marketplace of data, but what I really want to get to is, how can you put all these data products into a marketplace, but have some kind of system where you can understand, can I trust it? Do other people rate it, right? So we have the Amazon star system. I think at the moment, you're absolutely right. Where we've started, and the position that we started from, is we were starting to get to a place where people were creating their own data assets, their own data products, because they weren't being trustful. So they were moving away from centralization of data asset, where someone was saying, we're going to own this data asset, to decentralized, and everyone was going to do their own siloed. And for me, in order to bring that into a more federated culture, we need to have autonomy, but within a framework and a governed framework. But we can't do that without bringing people together in a more trustful relationship. So the people with the problem, in my mind, have to go solve the problem. So it needs to be both those things at once. So it needs to be a collaboration, but also talking about, right, we need to have autonomy within a framework. We want to empower people to have this autonomy within a framework. But how do we build that framework? And how do we do just enough that it's not going to be so frictionful that it's going to stop the speed of innovation that we want with AI and the speed of innovation that we want outside of AI? So even just doing things like ML and just doing more, if-then statements in code based on data, right? Let's not forget that. But how do we get to that kind of space where we've got just enough that we do have the ability to trust our data, that we have the right data producer, data consumer contracts, so that people are able to say, hey, hang on a minute, you made some schema change here. This is going to break what I'm doing, and you can't keep doing that. And if you do that, I'm going to rate you really badly in this like data marketplace that we have. And so for me, it's both of those things together that have to happen in parallel.
Yeah, and I think you can't start by sort of saying like, we're going to do governance and let's try and change the culture to make it work. Yeah. So we haven't tried to do that, but we've sort of started actually probably a bit more heavily on the culture side to then say, let's get to that right level or minimum governance. The more we trust each other, then the more we sort of can understand why like governance is a helpful thing for us. Whereas if we start by saying like, all data must be governed, it must be perfect, that was kind of like almost leading to the lack of trust and somewhat the moving away from the central, because the value of governance wasn't like well understood and the differences were becoming more frictionful rather than less. So the getting people together has been really important. And again, for me, from a AI and innovation point of view, I really want to be able to trust my data, and then I need to be able to like build products on top of it that are like, we've got so much data. It's a really big thing for us, like to have all these customers, all these orders, all this information about partners. And so the more that I can sort of trust that data, then I can build more like exciting products that add more value and differentiate and are closer to the day-to-day. So we have that sort of need and desire, but then sort of bringing people together makes people understand a bit more. When they understand, they can change. And then we can put the right amount of structure in place to then sort of maintain that change in the long term. And that's kind of a lot of how we're seeing it and how I'm sort of seeing it come to life.
Yeah.
And the other thing, that I think is kind of interesting is, I think historically, when we've taken data, we've got these large data sets, we're doing a lot of analysis on it, right? So you're trying to figure out like, what's the end result? So everyone would always say, like, what's the answer that you're trying to get to? Like, what is the thing that you're trying to do? I think with AI at the moment, what's kind of interesting, and we are in its infancy, is that actually I don't know what the answer is, and I don't even know what question that I'm trying to ask. Now, obviously, if you give AI huge data sets, right, you're going to get a lot of hallucination. But equally, I think we are getting to a place where actually what happens if we opened up our data sets? You know, are we going to unlock data value and data insight that we've not had before because we haven't been able to computationally understand that via machine learning models or data science that we've had today? And so I think as well, it's like, how do we open up that data marketplace of data that perhaps we've kind of kept hidden or more buried because it wasn't cleaned or cleansed and we weren't really sure what to do with it? And I suspect a lot of organisations have a lot of these data sets floating around where they're not using a lot of this data because they're not quite sure what to do with it. They're generating it, it's coming out as an exhaust from systems, but they're not quite sure what question they might have, so therefore they don't know how to analyse it. And I think we're starting to see, and it's very early doors even for us at Jet, how do we start to look at this data? Maybe we can't trust it, maybe AI is going to hallucinate with it, but actually what happens if we started using some of this data that actually is just not getting touched right now? And so that's the other piece, right? How do we unlock this marketplace for even more low value data sets, or maybe data sets that haven't got, 5-star ratings on them? That's what I think is quite interesting for us, and it's unlocking value that we haven't seen before.
Yeah, but I think there's the analogy that you use around a marketplace is really apt because you would be tempted to put as much of that high quality data and low quality data into a marketplace and then just testing out what is a 5-star and what is a 1-star. But I think, that also comes with a lot of potential issues as well, because that then forces a message of, well, we're just going to create a data kind of marketplace that potentially becomes a data swamp, right? The analogy of data swamp being there's a lot of data there, but it's not used. So how are you at Jet taking kind of that, that push and pull of, we want to find out what is high quality data and low quality data without you then starting to go into the messaging of, well, we need to take the data and put it in one place to make it discoverable? Like, how are you being targeted in terms of determining what is good and what is bad? Are you trying to look for the low quality data and high quality data and then getting people to rate it? Or are you just using what you've got right now and then rating that? And even if it's 20% of the entire data universe, that's still okay? Like, how much are you taking new data that you've never seen before versus using what you currently have and then rating all of that?
So we are trying to understand at the moment via metadata and via some of our systems, like how much of our data is just not used or just not touched. So you could give it a 0 star because if no one uses it, let's just give it a 0. Like there's just no score and we know what that is. We're also able to look at, based on some kind of SLO, data that's high touch, but maybe doesn't meet our standards, right? So let's say, for example, we said this data set was going to be near real time, but actually it's not living up to that. We can give it a score. And so we're starting to think about doing it in those terms. At the moment, we haven't built out the human loop yet, and that's what we need to work on next.
Yeah. And how important, James, from your perspective, is it to not regress to a point where, you create, I saw you're nodding head around data swamps. Like, do you think that giving data to everyone is the right approach and then trying to get as much feedback, even if it's good or bad feedback? Or is it better to be more targeted in terms of let's have quality limited products and then have the adoption of those users and then grow the user base? Like how much are you kind of taking towards like one view versus another?
I am sort of looking at how can we make the most amount of good data available to the most amount of people as quickly as possible. So by that, I mean that I think there is like the data swamp risk where you sort of say, well, we raise probably billions and billions of events a day. And if you just slam all of those into something that someone can try and query and figure out what's going on, no one will understand what's going on. But where we maybe have been a bit far the other way, which is there's a very tight like gold layer of perfect data that is very, very highly curated. You can be very, very confident in it, but is then very slow because you have to sort of agree with a range of people we should make a change to it or add to it. Whereas what I want to look back with, particularly in a innovation space, is how do we get like maybe 1 or 2 layers down so it's not just the very rawest of data, but we've cleaned it sort of enough that we're confident that it's come from a sensible place, but it's actually quite a wide range because sort of in my world, we're trying and doing new things. So we're sort of like, we need a bit more wider access. We can't wait for things to be perfect, but to go right back down to the very sort of like every single click from every single person on day one is sort of not good enough. Yeah. So if we look at like a bronze, silver, gold layer, maybe that sort of model of we clean up our data and it gets more curated as we go, then that sort of unlocking that first layer of clean data where we say we know what a customer looks like and someone owns that and it's defined, but it's accessible to my product. So we know what a partner looks like. We know what their catalog consists of. We know how people interact and order. So we sort of get to that first level of good data. And that's really, I think, like my key target, because then that unlocks for me a lot more like controlled innovation, right? Where we're not trying to understand like totally kind of random data, but we're working with data we've got good confidence with to then unlock that future value in those new products.
Yeah, and I think it's really important because we always talk about in a good data and AI strategy, it's about understanding technology, obviously, but you also need to understand the mindset of how people are using it, the people that need to be part of that journey and the process of change. The one thing which is quite clear is that even if you enforce a framework, I think the organization needs to accept that that framework is going to change. It's a process. You can't just say that these are the guiding principles of using data or engineering practices, and that is set in stone. And I think that's always going to be the case, particularly with technology. Like AI is moving at such a rapid pace that enforcing one framework in a point in time doesn't make sense when it's going to change in 6 months' time. And the other thing as well is that and you think about a data engineer, and we go back to this shift left kind of concept we talked about. A data engineer, historically has been really good at that ingestion point, as I said, like taking data and the events and then landing that for someone to use. And I think technology now, if you think about like stream processing, you can actually, within the stream of real-time clicks, you can actually transform the data and clean it within the stream. So when it does land, it's not going to be like raw data. And I think the technology enables that shift left methodology around, if you're going to start taking this data from the application and then dropping it for somewhere to use, it shouldn't be the raw data, but because you can actually transform the data within the stream. So when it drops out, it's already cleaned. But I think the challenge here is that a data engineer to start to adopt the mindset of everything else we talked about today around, you need to understand the value, you need to understand the marketplace concept. Like those are going to be quite nebulous concepts for them when they were pretty happy running like, a message bus. They were just streaming things from Kafka or grabbing it from Oracle Golden Gate and then dropping it into a data warehouse. So from a roles and responsibilities, I'm interested to hear are you doing a lot of retraining of existing data engineers that have been on the journey with Jet for the last 5 years and retraining them? Or do you think there needs to be a little bit of acceptance around, let's hire new data engineers who have a new way of working, and then there needs to be a retraining of maybe data engineers to go into a different world, or maybe there's going to be the very unfortunate task of trying to performance manage them out of the business. How are you dealing with that discussion?
Yeah, so with us at Jet, one of the things that James and I are really passionate about is we want to constantly change and evolve, right? So I'm a software developer by trade, and when I first came out of university, I was COBOL, C++, C, and Pascal, right? None of these things exist, and actually the internet really wasn't even a thing, right? We definitely didn't have, the stuff that we had available, and my first job was on mainframes, AS400s, and that's what I did in finance before finance was cool. And we constantly had to evolve, right? Like as every year that goes by, there's some new technology, there's some new thing that's kind of happening. And what we're really passionate about is how do we become big kids in a big kid sandbox and constantly learn and grow and take everyone on that journey with us. I think we've got some really, really smart and capable people within Jet, and that's our passion. And how do we train people? So we do a lot of learning programs. We talk about Jetflix. We've got an AI ambassador program. And we are not just coming up with our own ideas for how we train, but we want to have smart people in the organisation also share that knowledge and share that wealth and say, right, okay, what are you learning and how are we learning it? So whenever we go on these kind of new POCs and adventures, we always try and have this culture of like bringing it back to the wider organisation. And so we're not specifically going out right now and looking for specific skill sets and disregarding others. I think instead we're trying to keep our eye on the bleeding edge and understand that bleeding edge, but at the same time being mindful and respectful that there's a skill set that we need to retain, but also bring everyone on that journey with us.
Are you seeing a very similar trend in terms of your organisation, James?
Yeah, so certainly for me, it's that a lot of people, particularly as Gen AI especially has grown and suddenly exploded onto the scene, are very excited about that, and that sort of excitement takes people back a little bit into that learning mindset, and that learning mindset is the most important thing for anyone, I think, successful in an engineering field, right? As we sort of say, every few years, everything's changed, whether it was the move to the internet, whether it was apps, whether it was cloud. Gen AI is just faster than that. And so that learning is the most important thing. I've had engineers come on this learning journey where we started building new products based on data that are just being totally superseded week by week and day by day by the movements. So only people who are able to keep that excitement by learning, to be excited that, hey, there's a new, even better data product, there's a new better model, there's a new better way to do things. They're excited then to say, okay, cool, how do I use that now? And that sort of model are going to be successful as we go forwards. And so we then, as part of we've gone through those journeys as well, but we recognise then that we want to continue to build that excitement in learning, but focused around then doing and capturing value. So to balance you could spend your entire day looking at this new thing's created, that new thing's created, maybe I can bring data in this way or that way, or connect it like this. We say, how are you going to use that? okay, do something with it, use it, learn, share that knowledge, and then continue on that cycle. Because the only way we've seen it going in the last few years is just faster and faster. So we're encouraging that sort of that joy in learning even more. And we always say, like, the most successful engineers have that sort of excitement, desire to learn, the ability to share what they've learned, and then the ability to put it into practice, like at pace, because then we like unlock that sort of value, and we're solving the problems that that we're here to solve, and that's really like what we're looking at.
Because I guess like the naivety of me as having been a data engineer before and now moving to data science and so on is that a data engineer sometimes craves like real time. I always need to be on the ball. If something that I did fails, then I need to be up at 1 a.m. Like it's like that kind of that grind of like 24/7. But actually now with the advent of AI, like you said, it's opened up the doors for you to almost be a little bit more slower, to assess what is the opportunity that I have to deliver value to the business. And maybe I should take a bit more time out of my day job to learn about AI. But actually, this also opens up the door of being able to now insert an organizational mind shift from what we've been doing to shift left. So funnily enough, shift left has the best possible opportunity of succeeding because AI has also opened up the door for people to also maybe, what do I want to get out of my job? Do I want to continue what I'm doing, or should I actually, move in more on the AI side of things? And that's definitely what we're hearing a lot in a lot of industries right now. Is that, if anything, this has just given everyone a bit of a pause. I'm like, well, there's this new AI thing out there. Is it going to replace what I'm doing right now? Maybe, but maybe I need to adapt to that. And like one thing which has always been the case is data engineer as a trade. As you mentioned, this is like, it's been adaptable. Like it's moved from AS400 to be like software engineers, application engineers to data engineers. In 5 years' time, it's probably going to be a different title, right? But it's going to be adaptable based on the needs and the winds of change in technology. So we talked a lot about like Amazon Marketplace and like putting in the right products and then consuming them. But if you take that parlance in terms of how application engineers are trying to access the data with different access patterns, I imagine there's no one size fits all. So, Liz, talk a little bit about like the different access patterns that you've looked at Jet and where you've been able to kind of blend in the best breed.
Yeah. So I think the analogy with the Amazon Marketplace is kind of an interesting one because I think about it a lot. When we look at kind of the bookstore that Amazon, I guess, started off with, we have hardbacks, we have paperbacks, we have Kindle, and we have Audible. And I think when Amazon first started out, they probably had tons of hardbacks and then a few paperbacks, and people got to pick, hardbacks are hard on my hands, I want to have a paperback. And then there was more Kindles, and now Audible's really taking over. And people are able to pick and choose. I think with the advent of AI, and we're spending a lot of time, actually, James and I, talking about this, because we just don't know, actually, and we're just doing a lot of experiments. Data engineers were spending a lot of time creating data products that were consumed maybe by a stream, maybe by an API. Actually, application engineers oftentimes don't want to consume a stream. They want late-state representation, so maybe that's via an API. Maybe that isn't fast enough. With AI, we're now starting to look at key value stores. We're looking at other ways of doing those things. And what we now need to think about, I think, is not just about having governed ways and federated ways of getting data into this marketplace, but having really clear ways of having access so that application engineers can make a decision on how best, given their application, they want to access that data. Do they want to have some kind of machine learning access pattern? Do they want to use an API? Do they want to have a key value store? Or do they want to have some other way of doing it? But making sure that for every data asset that we've got or data product that we've got, that we're providing as many of those access patterns as we possibly can. And I think that's a discipline that we need to try and get to, because what we are seeing is, yes, we've got that data available in our data marketplace, but maybe it's not Audible ready, maybe it's not Kindle ready. And so then that's the bit that's missing for a lot of time. So at Jet, that data is there. It's just not in a place that's consumable, and that's what lets us down. I don't know, James, if you want to elaborate a bit more.
Yeah, and I think we said a bit before about like depth of data engineers and breadth. We sort of say, well, like enabling those access patterns is kind of one of those kind of depth kind of capabilities for us. So application engineering world, we have consumed a lot of streams of data, And what will tend to happen at Jet is we'll see that a team needs to consume several streams of data. They then turn it into a local representation. They then do something with whatever that something looks like. But then each team ends up doing it kind of in their own way, in a kind of like doesn't scale or is different, or they've recreated from scratch something that exists elsewhere, but with their own like bespoke bugs that go wrong in its own particular manner. So that's been quite painful for us, where we sort of say, well, not just having the data assets, if you like, but having consistent access patterns is a really powerful idea for us to say, well, not only are you going to be able to make use of all of these like exciting governed tagged data sets, but if you want it via stream, you can have it via stream. But if you want to look at like the latest state of a customer or an order, we can do that for you, and you can do it in the same way. Access it by GraphQL. If you want to chunk it up into a RAG, so an LLM can make better use of it. But just sort of to have a half a dozen consistent access patterns that then mean the application world can build the applications that we want to build, and to unlock that sort of end user value is a real powerful part of that sort of shift left thinking.
Yeah, and as we said before, like fundamentally, like opening up these access patterns, as you said, sometimes all the rage is audible and then it might go to hardback. It needs to be backed by a data-driven decision that you should be opening up that access pattern. And at the moment, that can't be demonstrated. You can't see the observability of how the data is actually providing the value. Then maybe that access pattern is revoked for a certain point in time. But then you need to ensure that you give the flexibility that people can access the data where they want it to be, but then you can also close it if it's not being used correctly as well.
Exactly. And I think there's a huge opportunity for data engineers to really put a lot of focus in this, because I think it's going to become more and more important, especially in this new AI world.
100%.
And a huge gap.
Yeah. So I want to actually almost kind of finish off today around kind of between the both of you, for those who are budding data engineers or software developers, those who want to get onto the rung of, working in Silicon Valley or Silicon Roundabout in London. Maybe for you, James, like what would be like the top tip and trick that you would give to a aspiring data engineer in terms of what they should be looking for in order to adopt to a shift left methodology of being able to really deliver value to the business? So maybe first of you.
Yeah, sure. So say nail your core skills, right? So get really confident with technology, with how it comes to life, with what you're working on, but then sort of say, okay, well, how do I then use that to solve problems? How do I bring it closer to the value that we're creating? So how I'm not just a technologist, but I'm sort of thinking about my entire sort of like unlocking of value and working with like that wider group of people. So in that world of like everyone's now like creating value directly, we should be able to measure it. And we do that with the skills that we have. So the two things need to come together. You can't just be a technologist. You need to have that sort of passion for the why and the value that we unlock, and that care and concern for it.
And what about yourself, Liz?
I think having evolved so much in my career as a software developer, the one thing that I would say now is stay curious, because actually I think there's so much opportunity. I don't believe that actually AI is going to kill software development any more than I think AI is going to kill data engineering. I do think that it's going to change. I think it's going to evolve, and I think there's going to be new opportunity for us all. I just don't know if we know what that is right now, and we don't know where this is going to go. And so the important thing for me is I think stay curious, stay learning, and stay engaged, because it's going to be a fun, wild ride.
And I guess that's the kind of the take that we have from the audience, is to stay curious, to have that learning pathway, and maybe pair yourself up with mentors that can give you some experience in terms of what is that business value. And certainly for those who are joining us who really want to get onto the career ladder, maybe something to do is to not look for a tech job, but look for something that gives you that business experience. What is it that actually businesses are looking for in value? And then use the skills and learning from a technology point of view to apply to that. So I'd like to thank the two guests today from Just Eat Takeaway for joining us today, and hope to see you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.